a Cranfield webinar, that'd be fantastic. Okay, with that, I'd like to pass to today's host, Dr. Emma Parry, who is Director of the Cranfield International Executive Doctorate and Reader in International Human Resource Management here at Cranfield. Emma.
Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, as Rebecca said, my name's Emma Parry and I'm the Director of the International Executive Doctorate here at Cranfield. Just to set the scene a little bit, I'm sure we'd all agree that the current economic environment is one of the most challenging that businesses have operated in for many years. The downturn in the economy and the increasing unemployment in many countries has also led to things like reduced consumer demand. And while we obviously hope that this is going to improve and is slowly improving in many countries, I think we can agree that organisations are currently operating in a very uncertain and volatile environment. So what we'd like to do today is spend a little bit of time thinking about the implications of this environment for leadership, and more specifically how we can create a mindset for leaders to allow them to operate effectively within this uncertain and volatile context. So today we have two speakers who are going to address this from slightly different directions. Firstly, Donna Ladkin, who is a Professor of Leadership and Ethics here at Cranfield School of Management. And she's going to talk about the importance of poetry and presence in leadership. And I hope to get you thinking a bit about your own practice and leadership. Then we'll pass on to Mark Baker, who is Head of Risk and Assurance at Pentland Brands PLC, and also an Executive Doctorate researcher here at Cranfield. He's going to talk about his own specific business experience and also a bit about how he's used his Cranfield DBA to help his company within this challenging climate. So both Donna and Mark will answer questions at the end of the two presentations, as Rebecca said. If you do think of questions as we go through, please do type them into the chat box. But we will move to questions at the end of the two presentations rather than interrupting the speakers. And please do remember to keep your mute buttons on during the presentations, as Rebecca said. So without further ado, I will pass over to Professor Donna Ladkin to start us off to talk about poetry and presence in leadership.
Well, thank you, Emma, and thank you for that great introduction into what we're going to be talking about over the next 15 minutes or so. It's a different way of thinking about what are the requirements of leaders in a particularly uncertain and challenging environment, to think about the role of presence, poetry, and persistence in creating positive futures. I think the first thing that it's important to say is that creating a positive future within such an environment where there's so much uncertainty is a leadership activity. It is actually something that leaders need to do. It requires leadership. Now, if we think about leadership, often we get a picture of something like this. This is the way leadership is supposed to be. We think of it as being all-powerful, all-knowing, altogether wonderful all the time. And people who are taking up a leader role can feel that they're somehow a bit deficient if this isn't how they're feeling as they take up that role, particularly in times of uncertainty. However, the experience can be more like this, the actual experience, because although, yes, leaders, by virtue of being at the head of their organization, or by actually seeing something in the environment that they feel the organization should be pointing to, can actually have a sense of direction. Somehow it can often feel like, well, I don't really know what it is I'm supposed to be doing. In fact, some people think about leadership, in fact, as being what you do when you don't know what to do. So that's a key feature of what leading is actually about. So there's three big ideas. Emma talked about creating a mindset that I think are important, but we often don't really think about when we think about what is required in managing this kind of environment or leading through this kind of environment. The first thing I'd like to suggest is the importance of presence, the importance of actually being with the people that you're leading at any one point in time. I mean, here we have a picture of Rudy Giuliani soon after the towers came down in New York. And one of the things that was particularly apt about how he led at that time was the very physical nature of his presence with people in New York. So he was on the scene. And in fact, this caused a kind of renaissance in terms of his leading ability. I mean, it was only after 9/11 that he was even considered a possible presidential candidate. But I think it was because he very much actually was there. And here we have a quote from Paul Polnick, who suggests that the future belongs to the ones who are most fully alive in the present. And I think it's quite interesting because often when we think about leading, and we think about leading in times of uncertainty, our direct attention is often focused on the future, how things could be, how things might be. But in reality, we only get those signals of what might a possible future be by being fully present in the moment. And often that requires leaders to get in touch with those people on the grassroots level of organizations. Last week, we were fortunate enough to have the chief exec of Unipart, John Neal, with us for a presentation. And I was struck by the number of times that he talked about how often he went and actually walked around the factory floor to meet the people who were actually producing the parts that Unipart creates, manufactures. And he really emphasized the importance of picking up these signals from being fully present with those people at all parts of the organization. As I think lots of times leaders and organizations can only talk to their senior team, and whereas that's really helpful, especially in times of uncertainty, those people in the organization who are most customer facing are the ones who can really pick up the small signals of change in the environment and trends in the environment. Actually being alive to those people and picking those signals up is very important in creating a positive future. The second idea is the idea of poetry. Now, poetry may not be something that we often associate with being a leader. And here we have an image, the image of the two roads that are diverging in the wood as a reference to Robert Frost's poem about the road less traveled. And I think lots of times leading is about taking the road less traveled. I rather like this quote by Martin Palmer, who suggests, "It's only when the poets have made us look again, inward and outward, that we shall see our way." Now, in suggesting that leaders might engage with a poetic way in looking towards creating positive futures, I'm not actually suggesting that you should all go out and buy Robert Frost and start reciting him to your followers. However, what I am suggesting is that the notion of poetry, the notion of metaphor, the notion of story, the notion of how people actually make sense, it's actually a poetic function, making sense. So what I'm suggesting here is that when we're looking into the future, using metaphors to think about what would we like the future to be like. And once again, when we think about those people those leaders who've been particularly good at capturing people's imagination in creating a positive future, it's those people who talk about dreams. It's about people who use kind of powerful imagery to engage their followers' imagination, as well as, these are the performance measures that will say that we're hitting where we want to go. And finally, a third idea that I think creates a kind of mindset which is helpful in creating positive futures is one of persistence. It's one of realizing that actually you're not going to get things right the first time. It's about actually trying things out, seeing what happens, modifying what you're doing slightly, and then trying again. So again, in looking at the stories of many leaders who have led their organizations through difficult times, one thing that often comes across is the fact that they didn't get it right the first time. It was only through being persistent. So this quote from Tobias Wolff speaks to that. We're made to persist. That's how we find out who we are. Lots of times organizations, in trying out new ways of being, they don't do it by just imagining their way through it. They have an imagination, and then they try that imagination out. A last image that I'd like to leave with you that speaks to how these three mindsets or qualities of mind come together is that of the New Zealand waka. This is the Polynesian sailing boats that use traditional modes of navigation for making their way across vast tracts of oceans, where they're not actually using GPS. In fact, there's a recent waka has actually gone out and has traveled to the Easter Islands from New Zealand, has recently returned. And here, the notion of the waka is a kind of principal idea that these sailors use in navigating without our technical equipment. And that is the idea of a thread, the thread that connects the past, the present, and the future. These Polynesian sailors are actually using traditional navigation methods that come from the past, which I think is often a really important thing about thinking about creating a future. The most creative futures in organizational terms are deeply embedded in something that is intrinsic to the organization. It's often not about leaping into, completely uncharted waters. It's about going back into the organization's history, its DNA, to find out what is really critically intrinsic about how we are as an organization, and then finding a way of navigating the seas of uncertainty into a future which still speaks to this past. And so to leave you with a few questions that I hope kind of pull these ideas together in terms of creating positive futures, some questions that you might want to think about. How can you be more present, and to whom, as organizational leaders? How can you connect those followers that you're leading with possible futures through the use of metaphor and positive imagery? How can you build your own resilience? And I think this is a very important aspect for leading in times of uncertainty. Leading in times of uncertainty is challenging, it's stressful. How can you actually build your own resilience and that of your team through these difficult times? And by what do you navigate when the going gets tough? What are the things that you can draw from in your organization's history, in your own history, to navigate through these challenging waters? Thank you very much. And now I'll pass on the ball to my co-presenter, Mark Baker, who's going to be talking about some of these ideas in terms of how they actually can be played out in an actual organizational environment.
Thank you, Donna. I'm going to talk about using evidence-based approaches to try and tackle difficult challenges, but also to help realize business opportunities as well. My perspective is, or my background is, I work in the branded footwear and apparel industry as a risk manager, so by definition, part of my role is being a constructive pessimist. My background is in engineering and supply chain and finance. I've held finance director and operations director roles. I'm currently in my 4th and final year of the Cranfield DBA, and I'm writing at my thesis at the moment. One of the things that Donna said was about leadership is working in uncertainty, and certainly I think trying to live in a buckle world, even with all that volatility and uncertainty, we're working in businesses where we're still wanting to have confidence in delivery of planned cash flows. And that becomes important to recognize the challenges that might get in the way of achieving that. And sometimes we can be lucky to actually see those important things, because often we don't. And that actually requires honesty and challenge. Sometimes, we think we can sit around a table and solve the problem, and that's the type of managerial conceit that's really important problems that we can't. And how often do we really consider the risks in our strategy or the risks in implementing our strategy? And therefore, an evidence-based approach is one way to challenges in a more effective way. One of the ways of thinking about an evidence-based approach overall is about doing the right sort of thinking. Often we don't always try and really understand the core of a problem. If you can try and imagine a funnel at the top of a wide funnel, that's the way we often see a problem. And how often do we really try and drill down and see the crucial thing that's deeper, that if we actually made a change, could make a significant benefit to what we're trying to do. So it's using that right thinking, trying to understand what the core of the problem is. And if it's a really important problem or a difficult challenge, you'd probably want to find what the best minds think about that, what they have to say on the subject. And that is using all known knowledge to help find those solutions, which is obviously quite a rigorous approach and requires research. Now, sometimes you might actually find that there isn't the knowledge there to help tackle the issue that you're facing that's important. That in itself can be an opportunity because you might have an advantage by getting that understanding first. And the model that I'm showing here is one of engaged scholarship from Andrew van der Ven, which is this idea of trying to look at real-world problems and then looking at the literature, let's say academic literature, to see what the theory says when you understand what the core problem is, which might be an organizational issue, it might be a control issue. And from that is building models or ideas or frameworks that you can actually test in the real world and see if they can help solve the problem. The other interesting piece on here is the word reliability. Is when you've done that piece of work, is that when you're working with management teams trying to put forward these ideas, that they actually believe they can help is an important facet of evidence-based approaches. And I think this is where my DBA at Cranfield has fitted in. It is trying to solve an important, complex problem in our industry, and I'll talk about it in a minute. And it's also using, I think, this evidence-based approach. What I realized when I started studying here, that from a business commercial world as a practitioner, I never really thought of looking at academic literature for ideas to help solve problems. It just didn't really seem relevant. And also when I can see there's a lot of academics who think that solving business problems to sort of develop theory isn't very relevant either. But the DBA is actually planting a flag right in the middle of that relevance gap. It's actually coming up with ideas and frameworks that can be used in the commercial business world, but also can develop theory in academia. The business problem I've got, I work in a business where we have over a dozen brands. Quite a few of them are selling products in over 120 countries around the world. And for some of those businesses, almost 80% of the product ranges are changing globally every 26 weeks. So that's very, very demanding. Talk about volatility and uncertainty, especially with fashion trends and material changes and construction of product. So what we're actually managing is large, complex new product development portfolios. It's a lot of product that we're trying to see what is likely to work or what isn't. And obviously at the end of the day, we're trying to get the most value out of launching those products into the market, but at the same time making sure we're getting strategic alignment. We're balancing the short term and the long term, and we're meeting all the needs of the brand in its particular life stage. So that directed me when I started my DBA. The academic literature I looked at was in control systems, in new product development, and also managing new product development portfolios. Having looked at all that literature, I was able to sort of synthesize it and come up with a new framework. In fact, it's a sort of a governance framework. It's about the quality of the controls that are applied in new product development. And over the past couple of years, I've been testing that framework out to see what would happen. And the results, the evidence-based results, are showing that all of those businesses I've worked in are working with tighter new product development portfolios. They are reduce the amount of excessive or wasteful new product development, but it's about getting that balance of control and creativity. They don't feel as though they're stifling creativity, but are still able to achieve the profit numbers that they're looking for. So profits have been increasing, and the products that are being sold into the market this year are making substantially more money than they did a couple of years ago. So as far as my organisation is concerned, probably have helped to solve all this problem, or certainly be able to respond better to this challenge, and it's created an opportunity. From an academic point of view, I may have been able to make a contribution to management control systems theory, and in practice I have a toolkit and a framework that management teams can use to help improve their process, their management product portfolios. The thing about evidence-based as a sort of that I found is the best that it gets when you're making suggestions to a management team of how to improve the things is they often say, oh, this is obvious. We don't do it, but it's obvious. And I warn those people who take an evidence-based approach, it probably doesn't get much better than that, but it's still very worthwhile. I've obviously found that I can't go on that sort of journey without a significant amount of personal development. The knowledge and research skills that I've gained have been fantastic. And I'm often finding that I'm having to defend my arguments in front of quite a number of people, and it helps, you think, with critical thinking and being able to present stronger arguments. Being at Cranfield, I'm obviously surrounded by faculty and colleagues who've just been inspiring through the whole of that journey in the way they've helped me think through the problem and how to go about the process. Very supportive. Of course, if you're able to develop some contribution to new knowledge in theory, you have the opportunity to become authoritative on a subject, which can even lead into writing and publishing and possibly academic writing. And all of that, when I brought it back into the workplace, has definitely helped me with problem solving. And what I'm finding is, over the past couple of years, I'm now getting invited to be involved in more important, complex problems at work. So that's one of the rewards I've had of going through this. And another nice thing is, obviously, if it's a crucial area of the business, you're often seen as an expert. So in summary, what I found from an evidence-based approach is it's really helped me understand the core of the problem and getting the best known knowledge to find solutions, and using applied research in a rigorous way that management teams have found helpful to move them forward in a VUCA world has been very valuable, not just for the business, but for myself personally. Thank you for that. I'll now pass back on to Emma, I think, who will lead the Q&A.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so time for you to ask some questions. I can see we already have a couple of questions from Michael, who's online. So perhaps if we kick off with those, and there's one for each presenter. So if I ask the question to Donna first, perhaps. So, Donna, Michael's question is, what are your thoughts about presence in today's dispersed working environment? In my organisation, most of us work from home, away from our colleagues and customers. Is some form of social media the answer?
I think you need to pass. Do you need to pass it, or can I just talk?
No, you can, everybody.
I can just talk. Okay. What a good question. What a really good question. It's really interesting that, because so many of us work virtually, and virtual working can be so useful, and in many, many ways. I think what's interesting about virtual working is that, in fact, there are two bits of research that I know of that have been going on around this idea, and what impact it has on terms of the kinds of things that you can only get through presence. One is that it does seem that those teams for whom they do virtual work, however, they do have times when they actually get together physically, that seems to be most productive in terms of ways of working. It seems particularly the first time we engage with someone as human beings, it seems that it's very helpful if we can actually engage with people in the flesh. Once we have actually met somebody, then it's much easier to maintain a virtual relationship with them. But actually that meeting seems to be very important, and particularly in developing trust, in developing an understanding of how each other works. It seems we pick up a lot of information. So I suppose what my idea around that would be, yes, for sure, organizations are moving to this model of more home working and so forth, but I think the ones that are doing it most successfully also have points of contact where people are expected to come in to interact with each other on a physical basis as well as just the virtual. It seems to be that we need a mix of the two, and that seems to be optimum. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Donna. And another question from Michael for Mark. How do you balance management's requirement for immediacy of information with the need for proper longer-term research? Good question.
That's a great question, another great question. One of the things, it obviously doesn't suit every individual, but actually having within a team people who are prepared to do that, who will consider the long-term and short-term, are quite valuable. We're finding in our organisation more people trying to do MBAs or part-time MBAs while they're working, and people like myself who are trying to do research in certain areas. And it's part of, I think, a corporate value to try and bring good outside knowledge in. If the company doesn't have that value, it's very difficult. But if it does, then the orientation is to try and consider both the short-term and long-term implications. Another factor which seems quite interesting in a VUCA world that my research has found is there is a difference between public and private ownership here about long-term business and sustainability. So if you're really uncomfortable about working with too much short-termism, there might be opportunities in good private sector businesses where they do take a longer-term view.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Another question for Donna. Before we move to this, perhaps if I can just urge everyone to ask their questions, either by using the chat function or, of course, by raising your virtual hand, if you'd rather ask the question verbally. So a question from Gary for Donna. If you come into an organisation from the outside to lead it, how do you go about discerning its history?
Ah, good question. You talk to the tea ladies. Well, I'm saying that, flippantly, but actually a wonderful piece of work by a DBA recently, got his DBA, John Pillay, who's based in Australia, looking at turnarounds, and he interviewed a number of turnaround experts who I understand that, we're talking a slightly different thing, a turnaround expert from a leader coming in new to the organization, but in a way, the sorts of problems are the same, where the turnaround experts trying to figure out what's the history here, what's actually formed the problems. And what they do is, they talk to the people in the customer-facing roles. They talk to the people who are, not in the senior manager roles, often in the lower down the organization roles, because those people have the information. They will tell you what's going on. Now, that can be a bit more difficult, of course, if you are the chief exec coming into the new organization, and maybe the tea lady won't tell you lots of stuff at the beginning, but interesting, a number of senior execs that I've worked with, they often say that it's easier to get information from people lower down in the lower ranks of the hierarchy than those people who are closest to them. And actually having those kinds of quite candid, encouraging those kinds of candid conversations with people throughout the organization. I think, lots of times people say it's hard to get the information, but in fact, I think you might have had, I think you will have done your qualitative project, or you're about to do that on your DBA. What people often come back and tell me as they've done that is people are so willing to talk. If you just ask people the questions, you can get all kinds of information. So it really is just about asking questions and probing a little bit. Why, why is that? Why do you do that? I see that, especially when you come in new to the organization, those things that are different about the way the organization operates, they kind of hit you in the face. And being attentive to those things that hit you in the face and that sometimes you might kind of, put to one side or not think about, but actually pursuing them, finding out, getting different versions of the same story. It's actually saying, I've got to be quite proactive in doing that. I think, that's one way, anyway, of starting to unearth that kind of history.
Okay. Thank you very much, Donna. Okay, another one for Mark here, so we seem to be going alternatively here. Okay, so this is a question from Ruth, and she says, I'm interested to hear from Mark how his DBA experience has helped him build his resiliency in the workplace. Are there things that are part and parcel of the DBA that helps with his critical aspect of personal effectiveness?
Nice question.
That's a very good question. My immediate thoughts are is about the journey that you go on. One of the things I've mentioned is about thinking things through very carefully and having evidence to support your arguments. That seems to stand up quite well in the workplace when people are challenging you and they haven't got the evidence and it's very subjective. So if you choose a certain direction, you select a strategy, or I make those decisions to go in a particular direction, I have probably thought it through more now than I ever used to. That's part of the DBA training. And I think that seems to have an effect on the management teams that I'm working with, is they recognize that and they have to up their game if they're going to challenge me and trying to push me onto a different route. So I suppose that makes me more resilient in that sense, but not any less adaptable, because I think the DBA also keeps you open-minded all the time. You're always still looking for the best knowledge and ideas to bring into your thinking. The other aspect of the DBA in these lines is critical thinking itself, is really looking at what you're trying to do and say, is this good enough? Does it make sense? Is it logical? So those are all parts of the interesting journey I've been on that I do think have helped me be more resilient in the workplace. The other thing I've mentioned in my presentation is when you're doing a doctoral colloquium in front of a lot of people, or you're in front of your panel presenting your work and trying to argue why what the findings are valid, you become more confident about what you're presenting, and that's definitely been a valuable factor. So I would advise, for those people who are really up for it, and it's obviously quite a challenge doing a DBA, but if you want to really make a step change in personal effectiveness, I think a DBA is a great mechanism for doing that.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And thank you for your support of the DBA program there, much appreciated. Okay, do we have any other questions? I can't see any other questions on.
There's one for Donna just come in.
Oh, yes, sorry, thank you. There's one just come in at the last minute from Gary.
And another one for Mark.
Okay. Last minute rush of questions. Okay, so from Gary to Donna, following on from the resilience aspect, do poetry and persistence fit together? They seem unlikely bedfellows.
What? I'm really curious to know why you see them as unlikely bedfellows. Poetry and persistence. Why would they be unlikely bedfellows? I mean, I think. Do you want to? Can you write anything more about that, Gary? Has he come back with anything?
Gary, do you want to expand on that? If you want to expand on that verbally, Gary, and you've got a microphone, you could take your mute button off. Or just... Hi, Gary. Hi, Gary.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Donna, I'm thinking that poets, certainly in my mind, poets tend to take an alternative approach to things, but I've never seen poets as really focusing on persistence and resilience.
Wow, yeah.
So it's almost a word into a particular situation,
yeah,
and then moving on almost.
Yeah.
So perhaps I'm confusing poet with a prophet, perhaps, I'm not sure.
Well, so I guess what I'm suggesting is that there's something in the poetic mindset which is around trying to see things differently, which actually can be a kind of hallmark of persistence. So it's kind of like, if I want to get somewhere, but the way that I'm getting there is not working, how else can I see this? How else can I frame this? How else can I think about this, which would give me a different way in? So I think it's about, so I think a poetic mindset can be a mode of persistence, as it were. You know, so that instead of, I mean, I think we can think of persistence in a number of ways. Persistence can work where you just keep trying the same thing, and and the same thing keeps coming back and saying, this isn't working. But I think a poetic mindset can say, well, it's interesting, I'm trying this way, it's not working. How else? It's not that the goal that I'm trying to get to, I don't want to get to, but how can I look at this differently? That will mean that actually maybe there's a different way of approaching this. I mean, thinking, again, going back to, were you here for John Neal's talk last week?
Unfortunately, we had another seminar that we attended, so
you didn't hear
John's talk, no.
But I think it's really interesting because one of the things he talked about was getting buy-in for a number of the decisions that he made with Unipart, and about how difficult that was. But it was interesting because especially when he needed to get the dealers of the Unipart organization engaged in a change process where they were trying to put customers first. And what he found out was that, okay, he got the managers on board, but then he wasn't able to engage the dealers. And I think, in a way, it's quite a poetic thing that he did, because what he decided to do was he decided to mount a musical. It was a 3-hour musical that he then went to all the dealers, and they actually they attended this musical. It was a very different way of getting the information across, but it got the information across. So I guess what I'm trying to say there, he was persistent in, he knew that that's what he needed to do. He needed to get the dealers engaged if he was going to make this shift. But instead of just going to keep, sending down 10-point bullet point plans, that kind of thing, what he did was think, well, what's a different form that I can use that will engage people? And he launched this musical and used this. And I thought, that's a kind of poetic way of thinking about that. What's a different approach here? So that's where I see the two of them coming together.
That's a good example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Gary, just to remind you to press your mute button again. Okay, I have another question for Mark. We're swapping between presenters here. Okay, so Mark, while the DBA allows you to take a deeper look at the problem, does it restrict you from shooting from the hip?
Is that from Gary as well?
No, sorry, that was from Schmidt.
One of the things I found with all the studying that I've done is actually when I'm working in a management team, I've probably thought it all through more carefully and more deeply than anyone else. So actually, if you're talking about shooting from the hip, I'm probably become a marksman. Therefore, I'm more effective and reactive in the way I respond. So actually, it's been beneficial in that situation as well.
Okay. Any more questions? Let me just have a final check so that I don't ignore anybody again. Okay. So just to say thank you very much again to our two presenters, to Professor Donna Ladkin and to Mark Baker, for some very interesting presentations, and also for some very thoughtful answers to some questions on the spur of the moment. And just to remind everyone that if you are interested in hearing some more about our International Executive Doctorate or DBA program, then we do have two information session webinars coming up. The first of those is on Monday the 17th of June at 11 AM UK time, and the second on Tuesday the 16th of July at 5 PM UK time. And the link for those should be on your screen now. Of course, if you want any information about that program or any information about the seminars, then I'm sure, please do, we'd be happy for you to get in touch. Thank you very much.